But this is also the last This Week in Jewish History. I am going to Israel early July. So today and Thursday are the last sessions I'm doing for this year in Shlichut, and I will be back in August. So there's stuff to look forward to then. But in the meantime, this is the last session in this subject. So I will share this in the meantime. Here we go, like we usually do. Okay, great. So I'll just want to, before I go into the events themselves, I want to just generally say what dates are we talking about. So again, be aware that we're talking about two different calendars, the Gregorian and the Hebrew calendar. So the Gregorian calendar is 21st of June to 27th of June, and the Hebrew calendar is between the 29th of Sivan to the 5th of Tammuz, and actually today is the first day of the month in Tammuz. And so because of that, we have things that occurred perhaps maybe early July or even almost towards mid-July, and they happen according to the Hebrew date this week. So it is interesting to see that how these different dates and events come together, basically. Okay, so we will now begin, and really this week we go from the Bible up until modern times as well, and as usual, it will be chronological, so starting from the year itself and not according to the date of the week that it happened. Okay, so the first event is actually really interesting because it's relevant to something we read in the Torah this last week. So according to various sources, in minus 1312 on the 29th of Sivan, that is according to the Bible, the 12 spies were sent to Israel. Now, this is a story we actually read in last week's Parsha in the States, but if you were in Israel, like my dad, you read it 2 weeks ago. And that happened in Passover because we weren't on the same calendar, and ever since we are a week behind Israel in reading the Parshas. So in this situation, there were 12 spies sent to Israel, and they were told to have their lookout or notice certain things about the land, whether it was the people, whether it was if they are in towns or it's walled or not, what is it like, meaning you can see in the picture on the right that they're bringing fruits, and really give objective information about what to expect. What is the terrain? How are they going to conquer this land when they come in? Now, the result, the consequence of this event was the fact that they weren't completely objective. They were in fact a little bit subjective, and that's what a lot of commentaries say, which is why they were punished afterwards, that they said not only, certain information, but they also added to the fact that we can't go. It will be too much for us to try to conquer Israel. And we can't go back to Egypt now, so we are doomed to die in the desert. And the consequence that really happened from that decision afterwards, the way they reported what they saw in Canaan or future Israel, was the fact that God punished them, and it was decided they were going to have to roam around the desert for 40 years. And this whole generation that left Egypt wouldn't have the opportunity to go into the land of Israel to experience what it was like to conquer and be in their own land that God promised them, that it was promised to the next generation in that case. So the consequence was really major. And we sometimes don't even think about that effect, that another 40 years was added of wandering the desert because of this one event that happened, that the spies went to Canaan, saw what they saw, and then decided when they came back to report something a little bit different than what they were requested to report. So that's one event that we have this week. That's from biblical times. We can really see the consequences on our nation that it had afterwards. From this point, we're jumping a lot into the future. And our next event and the consequence we're going to talk about afterwards is from the 25th of June, 1240, and that's when the Paris trial began. It's called Trial of the Talmud. And this actually is something that is, what happened was the Paris trial or the trial of the Talmud, what actually happened during these trials was that the Christians or Christian leaders, and including the Pope and King Louis IX, and I'm not mistaken, they were debating and supposedly against the Jews who had to defend themselves regarding the horrible things that were written about the Christians in the Talmud. And it's an interesting thing to just be aware about, that they couldn't say anything horrible about the way Jews, have commentary about the Bible in any way, because the Bible is also their holy book. But the Talmud is the commentary that developed afterwards, and it's very Jewish centric and oriented. It's a commentary specifically for the Jews, and they could use that source as something to attack the Jews as well. Now, the reason that this trial in the first place happened is kind of interesting, and then I'll go into what the result was and the consequence and the outcome. In 1215, there was the Fourth Loreno, I think it's called. Let me just make sure. Fourth Council of the Lateran. I hope I'm saying that correctly and not completely botching that. But in this council, they basically the church decided what they were going to do and how they were going to treat Jews and Muslims that lived in their jurisdiction, basically. And what the result was of this council was, one, that Jews and Muslims could not take public positions. Sound familiar? And also that they had to wear this white and red patch, which also sounds very familiar. Although the colors were different, the idea of the fact that they couldn't take any public roles and they had to wear something, that marked them in public, is something that I think gives us a lot of connotations to Germany or 1930s generally. We have it also in 1200s as well. And during this time, because the status of the Jews were changing and they were being considered less and pushed down, and they couldn't be front and center, they couldn't be in the public eye in any way, that we also see a lot of people, or a good amount of people in that case, a significant notable number of people who converted to Christianity. And these people who converted to Christianity would go to priests or leaders of the church, and they would tell them about sources in the Talmud that were against Jesus, they were against Christianity, and encouraging them to basically publicly go against this source. So there's a specific person that, let me try to make sure that I have his name correct, excuse me. That his name was Yochanan. Yochanan something, I can't find it right now. Yochanan from Dionin, something like that. And he was the known particular person who was a Jew who converted to Christianity. And he was the one, Nicholas Donin, that's his name. He went to the church and also referred specifically to Louis IX, who was King of France, and in order to make this a more public issue. And from 1236, that's when the whole discussion began about doing more research and investigation into what these sources are about that these converted Jews are mentioning about the Talmud. And officially on the 25th of June, 1240 or 1240, that's when the trial began. And with the King of France and his mother being present in the trial, there were among the judges that were there in the trial, there we have Christian leaders, and clearly the majority of the people who were determining the situation was the church, and the king was Christian as well. So it was clearly just an opportunity to discuss, to basically put the Jews in front center and kind of bash them or go against them, and how their important source goes against Christianity and how problematic that is. So there were a few rabbis who were leading in France, and they were the ones who defended the Talmud and the Jewish source. I didn't say their specific names because I didn't know them personally, but there are 4 rabbis who led the discussion and in the defense of the Talmud and the Jewish people generally. So it's clear what they were, what the church and the king were against specifically regarding the Talmud. But I found interesting is what the rabbis responded to these claims. So first of all, they said that the Talmud was a very old source. And I think it's funny because I think, 1200 is such a long time ago. And they're saying, it was written 700 years beforehand or even more. And it was the oral commentary that was added to the Tanakh, to the Bible. And it's an interpretation. So the fact that we have all these sources and claims means, they're saying it's, really old already at this point, and we can't rely on it to that it's still relevant to today, because when it was codified in 500, that is still 700 years ago. In addition, they were also trying to point out that people who are Christian, and there's a lot of sources proving this, people who are not Jewish and still go by the 7 Noahide or Noah laws of Noah, basically, that they are still redeemed, they have a place in the next world, and they quoted a lot of sources that mentioned that as well, trying to prove that in fact they have nothing against Christianity. And in fact, if they follow those 7 mitzvahs that are the Noahide laws, then they're also going to be redeemed and they can go to the next world as well. And the last thing that they claimed was that the Jesus that's mentioned in the Talmud is actually somebody else. And they were able to prove that the times that the Jesus in the Talmud is mentioned is a different time than, Jesus from the Christianity was around. And there is also even a source that refers to him as Yehoshua ben Pilchia. So all those arguments were given to basically say that the Talmud is not really against Christianity. You have nothing to worry about. All these sources that you're saying, they're not relevant. And in fact, it's a book that is not against Christianity at all. Now, what was the consequence and the significant outcome that actually happened from this? Well, quite expected, in my opinion, the church determined that the Talmud was a source that was against Christianity. And for the first time in the Middle Ages, the Talmud was burnt. And that was a significant outcome because it began a series of events in the Middle Ages and also afterwards where the burning of Jewish books became a symbol, a common thing to basically show that as the leadership and authority, they do not approve of these sources and there is something wrong with them. A source that was from the time says that over 40 carriages of copies of the Talmud were burnt. They burned for over 2 days. It was the first time, and again, as I was saying, it was the first time in history that something like this, that was such a public spectacle, it happened. So it was very significant because it begins this waves of hatred that we see in Europe in the Middle Ages, and it began with this trial that a converted Jew to Christianity was so adamant and important to him to let the leadership of the church know that there's problems with the Talmud, that this trial happened and this publicly displays of hatred began. So I think that it makes us think about, our actions and what they can cause. And I just also want to quote the quote from 1820, Heinrich, the German poet Heinrich Heine. I'm hoping I'm saying that correctly as well. Where they burn books, they will ultimately burn people as well. So I think that definitely resonates when we're talking about the Holocaust, for example, or the 1930s in Nazi Germany. But to think that it started from here gives, in my opinion, at least for me, a little bit of chills as well. So that's another different kind of event that we had that has a significant outcome and consequence as well. So we have the Spies, and we also have the Talmud. And our next event, we're jumping a lot and coming to the 20th century, where we have the second of Tammuz, which happened to be in this year July 11th. There's a 6.2 on the Richter scale earthquake in the Jordan Valley. And I'll say that this is the biggest earthquake that has happened in Israel in recent times. And when I was in high school, it was always discussed about, oh, it's been 100 years, every about 100 years, there's this really big earthquake and, we're prepared and we're thinking about it. We know about it. It hasn't happened yet. And I hope that we are in fact prepared if it does happen. But this earthquake really had a lot of, had consequences and outcomes and effects of the area. So I'm just showing this picture. It happened in the northern part of the Dead Sea. So this is the epicenter. And along the border here of the Jordan Valley, we have I don't know what you call it, tectonic plates, or I said Rift Valley. It's the Syrian African plates. And that when they go back and forth and create earthquakes, that's where it happens generally. So here the epicenter was in the northern part of the Dead Sea, and it affected Tiberias, Nablus, Jerusalem. They mentioned Ramle as well, which is about over here in between. So it really affected distances basically, and the result was that there were at least 300 people who were killed. In Nablus, there were 150 killed, and there were 250 who were injured. And in Jerusalem, you had almost 450 who were injured. So it really had an effect. And just to show, the destruction that there was, there are two pictures here on the side as well, showing what kind of damage happened as a result of the earthquake. And interestingly enough as well, the two holy sites that existed at the time in Jerusalem, which was the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, were damaged because of it as well. So it really had an effect on the whole area, and a lot of houses were damaged, a lot of people were injured, a lot were killed. And it's a different kind of consequence that we're dealing with and seeing here, but also natural disaster has a place as well and has an effect on the ability to move on and to develop and to grow. Because if your house just got ruined, you have to take a few steps back and be able to try to build yourselves from the beginning. So this really had an effect in the beginning of during Mandate Palestine, because that's our 1917, and when you have all these different different settlements and Zionism waves of Aliyah who are coming at the time. So this was really a major point that kind of changed that and changed the situation for a few years of rebuilding and rehabilitation. So that's a nice short and sweet thing about something that happened, the event that happened this week that had an outcome and consequence. And I think it is different than other events that had consequences regarding people, but it goes to show how much a natural disaster can have an effect as well. So the next one is longer and more significant, and I think interesting. So that is from 1976. So June 27th, 1976, a plane from Israel to France was hijacked to land in Uganda, in Entebbe, which is known later on as the operation in Entebbe. But just before I go into the details and share a video that shares the details very briefly and quickly better than I do, I just want to take a step back and explain what happened up until this point that led to this situation. So at the time, we were talking about the 1970s, we had terrorism of the Palestinian Liberation and various terrorists who assisted in that as well. And I think that the notable thing that they also did was in 1972 with the Munich Olympics, that the entire Israeli delegation was murdered by these terrorists who are Palestinian and were fighting for Palestinian liberation. So what happened is that it was a flight from Paris to, from Tel Aviv to Paris, and it stopped on the way in Greece, in Athens. And during this stop, 4 people aborted, and people were a little bit suspicious, but basically what happened afterwards was they hijacked the plane. they forced the plane to refuel in Libya, and then finally landed in Uganda as well. They separated between the Germans and the Israelis and claim that in the next 48 hours, they demand that 40 prisoners in Israeli jail that are convicted terrorists need to be released, and 13 additional prisoners from different countries as well. If they did not agree to these terms within the 48 hours, the Israelis would be killed. I unfortunately do not remember, I didn't write how many people we're talking about, but from my recollection, we're talking about 80 people more or less. There were 250 people on the flight, and maybe I'm confused that 80 people were not Jews, and I think 125 were Jews. It's important to note that most of them were Israelis. However, there was a couple from an Orthodox couple from Belgium and from the U.S., and a French-Israeli citizen who's also a French citizen, that they were just put alongside with the Jews because they were Jewish, and it was clearly notable that they were Jewish as well, and they were related to Israel in that case. The only thing that happened that shows perhaps the more kindness of these people was that a woman who was pregnant and she pretended to have a miscarriage, she was released in Libya and not brought to Uganda afterwards. So that is what happened. That is the situation and the event that occurred on this day. And I want to share, first of all, the video that happened that explains what happened afterwards, which will relate to the different pictures that are on this slide as well. And also the outcome that happened from this event as well, which is very interesting and has unique implications regarding how Israel was seen afterwards. So I will now share that video, and then we will go back to continue talking. So one moment. There we go.
None of the 260 passengers and crew on a routine Air France flight from Tel Aviv to Paris were suspicious of the 4 people who boarded during a stopover in Athens. But within 15 minutes, the German-Palestinian terrorist squad had taken over the plane, forcing it to land in Entebbe, Uganda, where they were joined by more armed terrorists. After releasing most of the non-Israeli passengers, they threatened that if 53 jailed terrorists weren't freed by July 4th, they would massacre all the remaining 106 hostages. The Israeli government began to negotiate, while the army and Mossad started gathering intelligence and searching for military rescue options. It was a seemingly impossible mission. Entebbe was 2,400 miles away, in the heart of Africa, and the route there went through the airspace of enemy countries. Even if Israeli commandos could make it there unharmed, they would have to operate in unfamiliar surroundings with limited intel. If that wasn't enough, in addition to the terrorists, the airport was alive with hostile Ugandan army troops. But even if they overcame all these obstacles, they had yet to overcome the biggest challenge: time. They had to surprise the terrorists and eliminate them swiftly before they could execute the hostages, deeming the entire operation a failure. The task of planning the hostages' rescue and fighting the Ugandan army was given to Israel's elite Sayeret Matkal, led by Lieutenant Colonel Yoni Netanyahu.
Within less than 48 hours of planning by Yoni and his officers and training of the unit, a daring plan was prepared and the force was ready for action.
According to the overall plan of the IDF, 4 Hercules planes holding a selection of Israel's finest military and commando units would fly to Uganda at low altitude in order to evade enemy radar.
After landing, the rescue force, headed by Yoni, would move in a convoy led by a Mercedes mimicking Ugandan President Idi Amin's car in order to confuse the Ugandan soldiers and buy precious time on their way to the old terminal.
Other Sayeret forces would neutralize any Ugandan military reinforcements and disable the Ugandan fighter jets to prevent an aerial pursuit. The Israeli commandos struck with precision and speed.
I heard someone shouting that Yoni was hit. In parallel to this, the glass shattered and someone shot me in an automatic burst of fire from the inside. I shot him back. At the same time, my commander catched up with me. I turned left and killed another 2 terrorists. Within 15 seconds, 4 terrorists were dead, and the whole operation was secured.
Within less than an hour since landing, the hostages were on board the planes on their way home. Despite the heroic efforts of the medical team, Yoni died of his wounds. The bold operation amazed the world and gave hope to Jews across the globe.
During my 9 years in prison, each time I heard an airplane in the skies of Ural, I thought about Entebbe, and I knew that a day will come when an Israeli airplane will take me home.
Yoni, an unknown hero until the operation, was mourned by the entire nation and became a legacy of courage, commitment, and leadership for generations of Israeli commanders.
I just wanted to keep that at the end because I think it's very interesting that those people actually voiced in the animation video. So I think the video expresses well what we can see as a result and the outcome of this event. Israel used and took advantage of this as a great operation to be executed, and in fact succeeded. And I think the fact that it was successful really puts Israel on the map. People were in awe that these people were able to be saved. And I'll just share here, I'll share it once again. We can see, all the people coming out of the airplane and people hugging family members. And on the bottom right is Yoni Netanyahu, which is Benjamin Netanyahu's brother. And so every Yom HaZikaron, he often mentions him because it's his own loss as well that happened in 1976. And no matter how much time, it's always a brother you have lost. In any case, definitely the outcome and the significant thing that happened is that Israel was put on the map regarding their intelligence, their operational abilities and capabilities, the fact that this was so successful. And I'll also note that at the end of the day, Israel was not looked down upon or condemned for going into another person's territory, because at the end of the day, Uganda allowed terrorists to be on their territory, and they didn't encourage the terrorists to stop what they were doing and release the hostages. And we're talking about completely, obviously, innocent people with children as well. So that gave the reason for Israel to go into this sovereign territory and retrieve their own civilians and save the people who were there as hostages. So I mean, this operation is really incredible what they managed to do in such a short period of time, and the fact that all the people were saved. And I think it really is a significant event that happened in Israel's history and shows the operational abilities that it had pretty much about 30 years after it was founded. It's absolutely incredible that they succeeded in the way that they did. And that was the result, that it really put Israel on the map in that sense. Now we have one more event that happened, and then I would be happy to ask any questions that you have. I didn't see anybody writing the chat up until now, but feel free to use the chat, and if not, then we only are 8 people, so I'll open it up for questions afterwards as well. So our last event brings us up to the 2000s, actually. And I'll explain the pictures afterwards. But on June 25th, 2006, took place the kidnapping of Gilad Shalit. Now, I'll just go, backtrack and explain what led up to this point as well. And then I'll explain also the different pictures that we see here too. So I'll just point out that the June 25th, usually 2006 in the summer in my mind, is the Second Lebanon War. And the Second Lebanon War broke out 2 weeks later, more or less. But this happened on the Gaza Strip, unrelated, 2 weeks before. So on the southern border generally, and the IDF intelligence received information that there was a plan of Hamas terrorists to go into the area using tunnels with a possibility of kidnapping a soldier. But there is definitely an expectation that an attack could happen by Hamas terrorists from Gaza. And in fact, actually 30 hours prior to the kidnapping, a unit found 2 Hamas terrorists and were interrogating them. By the time they had found information about the attack, and because they knew information about the specifics, Gilad Shalit had already been kidnapped, so it was too late. Now, because they expected, however, that there was going to be some sort of attack, that they had to be, aware of what was going on, there were a few units that were on the border that were placed specifically there. So one was the Yahalom unit, which is a special combat forces unit that was placed there. There was also a reconnaissance tracking unit, which is a Bedouin unit that was there for surveillance as well. And there was a tank unit. Gilad Shalit was part of the tank unit that included 4 soldiers. A tank always has 4 soldiers. The commander and each soldier on the tank has a different position. So Gilad's position it's called Ta'an. He was the person who was supposed to prepare the weapon on the tank and shoot it. So that's his position. What happened is that at 5:30 a.m. on this day, only one soldier who was on guard duty was awake. However, this period of time, they were all supposed to be awake. I saw an interview that somebody was saying, no, he had the last shift and it was supposed to be up until 7. But in other locations, it says that this time of hour, or this hour when it's, when it's sunrise, they were supposed to be up already, just because that's when there's the beginning of light, people can see, but it's also, dark at the same time. So as a preparation or operational preparation, they were all supposed to be up. During this time, 7 terrorists penetrated into Israeli territory from a tunnel from Gaza to Israel that ended up in a place called Kerem Shalom. So Kerem Shalom is a settlement, but it also is a name of an entrance, the border entrance between Gaza and Israel. So it's also called Kerem Shalom. So it was around there that they came out, and they divided into 3 subunits, each one attacking. One was attacking the Yahalom, one was attacking the reconnaissance surveillance Bedouin unit, and 2 terrorists were attacking the tank unit. So the surveillance reconnaissance Bedouin unit managed to kill the 2 terrorists. However, 1 soldier of theirs was killed as well. And regarding the tank unit, by the time the person who was on duty was able to notify them that something was happening, they were just waking up and being aware of what was going on. So the commander of the tank and another soldier just jumped out, because that's what the commander had said, even though the tank was completely fine and not ruined. And then they were killed on the spot, unfortunately. And Gilad Shalit, he was next to the weapon of the tank, and he claims in various interviews to be such in shock of what was going on, and he just woke up, that he didn't shoot at the terrorists from the tank, even though he could have. At that moment, an RPG was basically sent onto the tank, and Gilad Shalit was wearing a vest, so a bulletproof vest. So the shrapnel pretty much hit him in the vest. It only hurt him in the shoulder and his behind, so it wasn't major damage to any vital organs, luckily, because of that vest. And he jumped out of the tank from, again, shock, but he left his weapon in the tank. So he had no weapon on him, and the only thing he could think of doing was surrendering. So in that case, you had 2 people who were killed from the tank, 1 person who was injured and survived and was alive, and 1 person who surrendered and was kidnapped. Gilad claims afterwards that it seemed that the terrorists did not have in their plan that they would kidnap anyone. They would take a prisoner, and they just jumped on the opportunity, blew up the fence, and ran back into Gaza. And they realized that this was something that would be to their benefit afterwards, or could be to their benefit for negotiating with Israel. I purposely gave information about this day because it is controversial as to what led up to his kidnapping and what happened afterwards as well. And in order to just explain the result, I will know that obviously, as you can see, Gilad Shalit was released. If you did not know, it was 5 years. He was kidnapped at age 19 and released at age 25. He was 19 and a half and he was 25 and a half. So it seems like 6 years, but it was, he just turned 25 and he was close to 20. So it seemed as if it was 6 years, but it was 5 years that he was in captivity. And I'll show a video 3 minutes long to just share what was the result on the day that he released, so we could kind of get a picture of what happened following this event, and then I will continue talking after that. So one moment, here I'll share that, 1 second. There we go. So it's a news channel, just note, but I thought that it expressed pretty well what happened after this event, or what we can see on the day that he was released and what led up to that point.
In one direction, they went in their hundreds, cheered as returning heroes. In the other, a lone, frail figure emerged blinking into the glare of publicity after 5 years of captivity. Israeli conscript Gilad Shalit was just 19 when he was kidnapped by Hamas militants and spirited into Gaza. Today, Israel bought his freedom with the release of more than 1,000 Palestinian prisoners. The Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu conceded the price had been very high, but said the country had a duty to bring home soldiers sent into battle. Our Foreign Affairs correspondent Jonathan Rugman reports.
Just before sunset, and Israel's long-lost son was home at last after 5 years, 4 months in captivity. Gilad Shalit's tiny village in Galilee turned out for a glimpse, throwing flowers, garlanding him with a sea of flags. The 25-year-old waved briefly before disappearing with his family. But despite the hero's welcome, the taste of freedom here is bittersweet. For in Gaza, the Palestinians were also rejoicing, in their hundreds of thousands, as Israel pardoned and released 477 political prisoners, some of them with the blood of hundreds of Israelis on their hands. The people want a new Gilad, they chanted, believing that today's returnees could be followed by many more if another Israeli soldier is caught. Gilad Shalit was delivered from Gaza to Egypt this morning. Egyptian intelligence brokered the deal. And with Israel unsure how friendly post-revolutionary Egypt will turn out, it was a deal Israel felt it had to accept now. And in a domestic scoop for Egypt's ruling generals, Shalit spoke to Egyptian TV first.
Did you ever think you will live to see the day when you can actually walk free?
They were long years. I believed the day would come, but it might not be for more long years. I hope this deal will help us reach peace between Israelis and Palestinians.
Shalit was a gangly 19-year-old conscript when he was abducted. Today he looked weak and unsure of himself, according to one official deprived of daylight. The Israelis put him back in uniform and promoted him from sergeant to sergeant major, before flying him into the arms of Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel's Prime Minister. I brought your boy home, Mr. Netanyahu told Shalit's parents. His father, Noam, kissed his son. And the unspoken message for the sons and daughters of Israel's army: we never forget our own, even if it comes at a price. The Prime Minister hoping today's release boosts battered Israeli morale, but painfully aware that it could also boost Hamas, who let Shalit go.
We will continue to fight terrorism. Any released terrorist who returns to terrorism is taking his life in his hands. We do not celebrate the release of murderers.
Meanwhile,
so I'll just stop there because I think it reaches the point in that case. And just to continue the discussion, and now I'll share the pictures as well. Gilad Shalit was released, and I'll say it on a personal note that when I go into the army, or when anybody goes into the army, part of the basic training is receiving this little pamphlet that we know the international law, that if we are God forbid, kidnapped, we give them this pamphlet and they have to treat us according to international law. Of course, Hamas is a difficult situation because they are a terrorist group and not a state entity. But that is something that is very much a part of basic training, that discussion, that thought that perhaps one day, God forbid, we could be kidnapped and we have to know how to act. And the fact that Israel was able to have him return home well and alive, and, yes, of course, he's been affected physically and mentally as well, and is recognized as such, of course, but that the fact that he was returned home was really a celebration in Israel and a meaningful moment. At the same time, they released 1,027 Hamas terrorists, and I just was interested in finding out, and I looked into it about, were there in fact terror attacks that happened as a result of these people being released? And the answer is yes, they were. According to information and research that was done on the subject, about 40% of the prisoners who were released continue to be involved in terror. 111 of the 1,027 are still in jail today. And actually, one of the people who were released was the one who thought up of the idea of kidnapping teenage boys in the West Bank. Ended up being 3 teenage boys, and it could have been other people, of course, but the person who thought up of the idea was one of the people who were released in the Shalit deal. And I just saw about 4 or 5 other terror attacks that happened, that were committed by people who were released in the Shalit deal. And people died as a result. There's a movement of people who have signed documents and signed petitions saying that if I'm kidnapped, please do not release any prisoners for me. Of course, it's a political statement saying that I don't want the result of my release to bring somebody else's death. And that's something we have to think about as well, that at the end of the day, on one hand, the result is that he returned home, and there was this great unity among Israel, knowing that we are together, we are one. He's all of our son, and he's home. And on the other hand, there's that scary idea of that these people who were condemned and were in Israeli jail are now released until they commit something else. And that's another thing to consider regarding Israel's security and how Israel acts generally. Another thing that is important to think about is that at the end of the day, the way that that tank unit acted on June 25th, 2006, was not according to protocol at all. What can we learn from that? That 18 to 20-year-olds are given that responsibility. How can we better prepare them? What can be done? And who is responsible at the end of the day? Is Gilad Shalit involved because of the way the situation ended up? Is it his commander? Is it the education or training he received? Should he have not been in that position if he was somebody who couldn't react at that moment? I'll just say that I had a whole discussion about it with John here about, who is at fault in that case, and where people are placed in the army, and can you know who is ready to act when the moment arrives, or just you can only know when the moment does in fact arrive. There are a lot of questions that come up in a whole debate that can be considered just from the whole situation that Gilad was kidnapped. On a different separate note, which relates to the picture on the top right, in February 2020, Gilad Shalit got engaged to, I forgot her name, so I think her name is Liron, I'm not sure. And they were dating for 1.5 years. And it was front page on every Israeli newspaper, and it was even in the New York Times as well, I saw. It was just a meaningful thing to know that somebody who was in captivity with Hamas was able to continue his life. He has a degree in economics and environmental studies from IDC. He worked in a bank. He worked as a sports commentator, and he got engaged. And it really goes to show that we have an opportunity to grow, and there's always a tomorrow. There's always a way to change our lives and improve our lives. And that's another different result and outcome as well, that, he's always going to have those 5 years of captivity, but at the same time, he was able to move on at the same time. And with that, with those questions in mind, and I'm happy if you have any comments as well, that brings us to the end of this week in Jewish history. And I'll just summarize and say that we covered a lot of different events and talked about different kinds of consequences. But from talking about the spies that were sent to Israel and the consequence of traveling for 40 years in the desert, to the burning of the Talmud after the Paris trial, and basically that marking the beginning of hatred and public displays of that hatred in the Middle Ages in Europe, which leads up all the way to the 20th century with Nazi Germany as well, when they did something similar and took it even more extreme. We afterwards have a earthquake that just caused destruction in Israel generally, to places that were homes or holy sites as well, and had a difficult result because of that. To Entebbe, of just hijacking the plane, which brought an operation that people did not even imagine before that, and put Israel on the map regarding its intelligence and operational capabilities, finally reaching to the more modern situation of the kidnapping of Gilad Shalit, the release of the prisoners, his own personal story, alongside the fact that he was returned home whole and safe at the end of the day. So that concludes the last This Week in Jewish History. And I really thank you for joining me these past 4 weeks. It has been a pleasure to do this and share, highlights about Jewish history. And I learned a lot myself. And I'd be happy to hear questions. In the meantime, as always, because I see that we do have a few people that I haven't seen before, which I'm very happy about, I'm sharing the information of the project I'm a part of, which is called Life Online. It's with other shlichim that live in the DC, DMV area and beyond. And together, we create content to provide a weekly schedule that has from philosophy to baking to history to literature to really a wide variety of stuff. I personally do the weekly email, and I would recommend signing up for that. It's a short Google form, and you can just click on that. And if you prefer Facebook, we have a Facebook group as well. Great. So with now, I see Tybal's already raising her hand, but please also feel free to unmute yourself if you have any questions. And Tybal, please.
So I have a comment and then a question.
Mm-hmm.
And the comment, this is a few years out of date, but when you were talking about Noahide laws during the Talmud,
Mm-hmm.
there is a movement, it may be only American, called the B'nai Noach, who are people who, not Jewish, pledge themselves to live by the Noahide laws. And the last time I looked was probably 8 years ago. There was a vibrant group in Gaithersburg.
Interesting. I didn't even know that. That's so fascinating.
Yeah, I thought you would. So then here's the question. When you were talking about the Gilad Shalit, you said something that surprised me. So as someone who served in the IDF, I've never served in any military, but I would start from the assumption that in human affairs, something is always going to go wrong. Things won't get executed perfectly. So planning would be assume that each of these things go wrong, recovery, whatever. But you said something that indicated, or maybe I misinterpreted when you said looked at, was he too young? Was he the wrong personality? Was it the training? Was it the commander? All those things.
Right.
Is there the assumption in the IDF that it is possible to set things up so there won't be human error?
I mean, that's a difficult question, but at the same time, I can also say that a lot of people claim that sometimes people who are not really fit for combat are put in combat just because they have the physical attributes, or that they're healthy people, when at the end of the day, maybe Gilad Shalit should have been in intelligence, for example, or a job that is not combat and front and center. I'm not sure. I'm just saying that that's something that is said often, that people are put into combat situations when in fact they shouldn't be there. And I can say also that I saw, what movie was that? Saving Private Ryan. And in that movie, there was somebody there who he was in charge of bringing bullets back and forth, and he was just scared. He couldn't move. He was frozen. And for me, in my mind, yes, there's human error. People are going to be shocked you can't prepare. But he shouldn't be in a combat situation. He originally wasn't supposed to be. He was someone who was writing and typing, and so I think there's room for that discussion of people being placed where they really can, really making sure that people who really don't want to be in combat or are scared in the first place wouldn't be there. I don't know if that was a situation for Gilad Shalit, or it was the fact that he just woke up from sleeping and he was just utterly really in shock. But and it's hard to judge when things are happening so quickly, but there's a lot of things that went wrong. That also they were sleeping, and also that he left his weapon inside, which is like a huge no-no. Also, he didn't shoot at the terrorist, being the person that he is in his position in the tank, that he was supposed to shoot on the terrorists. So there's a lot of questions if he's at fault or somebody else, but there's always expected to be human error, which is why you're in a unit with other people and you're supposed to, rely on each other and depend on each other. Thank you to Art and Peggy for your kind words. I really appreciate it. I hope that answers your question more or less. And it's
yeah, actually, that was a wonderful answer, because you were talking. Yeah, it was a wonderful answer, because it focused more on screening and more thoughtful setting up the structure in the first place, where human beings are different, and some personalities and who they are, not everybody, to go back to, not everybody's Yoni.
Right, exactly. Are there any other, thank you so much for your question. Are there any other questions about any of the events that we covered, or any comments? Yeah, Rita? You just unmute yourself. Anytime, yeah. There you go.
I don't have a question, but I'd like to add something.
Yeah.
On Entebbe, Israel knew exactly where the plane was at the airport. Israel had installed all the irrigation system in Entebbe, so they knew where every spot was.
Oh.
So it made it a lot easier to get to the plane immediately and succeed so fast.
That's very interesting. I didn't know that. Thank you for adding that information.
I was glued to the TV when that happened. Glued.
Really?
Yes.
I also wanted to say, and you reminded me, that I found it incredible. There are two movies that are already done about Entebbe. One was already done in 1977. So already a year after it happened, there was a movie. And the other one happened in 2018. Oh, sorry, I sent it by mistake, not to everyone. The full movie is from 1977, is on YouTube. So I sent the link here right now, and Tybal said to me privately, but she said, thank you, Rita. And it was fascinating to think about, to realize, how we can use all this information as intelligence information at the end of the day, that we have those connections that help us to do such an operation. So thank you for adding that information.
And we also lost one lady who had a heart attack. And she was taken to the hospital, but they couldn't wait for her, so the plane took off, and you never heard any more about that lady.
Oh.
She totally disappeared, yeah. That's all I needed to add.
No, it's important, because it's important to be aware that not everybody was saved in that case. And it's not only Yoni, but there's another person who was there that had a heart attack and couldn't receive that care because she was in Uganda. So thank you for adding that. And with that, I'll just ask one more time if there are any questions. And if not, then we'll conclude for today. And I'll just note that this Thursday at 7:30 p.m., there's a session of the last people of the book, where I'm hosting fellow Shlichim who will be recommending their favorite Israeli books, which shall be a lot of fun. Laura, did you unmute yourself?
Yes, I did, just to say thank you so much. This has been wonderful. Thank you very, very much.
Wonderful. I enjoyed it.
I'm really happy to
have an amazing trip, but come back to us.
I will definitely be coming back. I'm an American citizen, so all good.
Yeah. But soon to B'nai, I meant. Bye.
Yeah, I'll be back in August.
Have a wonderful trip, Netta.
Thank you so much, Cheryl. Thank you for
everything.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.